introduce Dr. Redelfs. Ann Redelfs is a retired psychiatrist. She's been studying human beings as far back as she can remember. She grew up in a small mill town in western Pennsylvania, Beaver. She was valedictorian of her high school class. She graduated magna cum laude with a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Duke University. She has a medical degree from Tulane University, where she completed 2 years of residency in pediatrics and 3 years in psychiatry as a fellow at another Tulane-affiliated hospital. However, she considers life her greatest teacher to whom she listens throughout each day. And I believe she will tell you a little bit more about her background as she talks to you about post-traumatic stress. And
first of all, I want to say how sorry I was to hear about what happened to Mayflower. Just to breathe my spirit. It brought me back to the days of the Redelfs catastrophe, which I was personally involved with. Just a second here. Yeah, that's it. A little further down, I think. That's it. And
just a moment.
I was wondering exactly where I should be pointing.
At the projector. There.
So here's my experience, what Joanne talked about, the water horizon exploding in April of 2010. By telling you a little about my story, I'd like you to see the similarities with your own. Oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico, which supplied our nation with a quarter of its seafood at the time. And the lives of the residents were forever changed. Much of the seafood we were accustomed to eating died or became contaminated. The recreational activities of swimming and boating became harmful. That man accidentally dribbled some water on his leg when he was boating. Those who worked in the seafood industry were without jobs. And property values in foul-smelling areas went down. Some people living along the coast got very sick. Do you recognize any of these symptoms? Well, all of this adds up to stress. Stress to our physical bodies, with tension and anxiety. Stress to our emotional bodies, grief, anger, depression, and guilt. If I only moved to Florida instead of staying around here. And also mental symptoms, like thoughts of hopelessness. There's nothing I can do, or so it seems. Now, the stressed animal reacts instinctively with fight, flight, or freeze. Our animal instincts move us to respond similarly to stress. We get aggressive with one another. Maybe we just want to run away and hide, or we may freeze and do nothing about the problems. Of course, these animal instincts can have useful, life-saving results. Our impulse to fight can help us stand up to those who are polluting our homes, communities, and food and water supplies. The desire to run may get us to leave a toxic site that would otherwise harm us. The inclination to freeze might be temporarily useful to stall our actions until we gather all the necessary information and think the situation through. But what happens with severe trauma is that traumas that are consistent or repetitive, is that we stay in these animal reactions, succumbing to post-traumatic stress disorder. Do you all know what this is? Well, PTSD results from exposure to something that is or is perceived to be life-threatening. When our instinctual reactions of fight, flight, or freeze don't alleviate our stress, and we become psychologically overwhelmed, we succumb to PTSD, which in my experience manifests in two ways. People with PTSD either freeze at the scenes of their disasters, meaning they repetitively reenact these scenes, or they run from these scenes, avoiding anything that reminds them of them. Most patients with PTSD do both at different times, and these PTSD symptoms can show up physically, emotionally, or mentally. Let's look first at physical symptoms. PTSD patients may act out or recreate their trauma as with physical brutality. Victims of physical trauma may become victimizers who assault, poison, accidentally injure, and otherwise hurt people's homes or bodies, their own included, in a way that's reminiscent of how they were once harmed. Have you noticed any residents in your area becoming aggressive? Compulsions are also normal. For example, when children are medicated for their natural reactions to traumatic experiences, they may later become addicts who compulsively turn to drugs to stifle their pain. PTSD patients who consistently involve themselves in stressful events or problems, they keep those stress hormones pumping through their bodies. Watching thrillers on TV is an example of this. There are also emotional symptoms. Victims of, Victims of physical trauma may also avoid anything physical that brings the trauma to their attention. Ignoring body sensations or symptoms, like coughs or nausea from exposure to toxins. They think, oh, I'm sure there's nothing to this, nothing to worry about. There may be difficulty sleeping. Perhaps the person fears the trauma will recur while asleep. There can be skittishness. These PTSD patients are quick to leave when anyone speaks of trauma, such as a report of the ever-increasing number of oil spills across our globe. There can be obstinacy. This trauma survivor will not do whatever reminds him of his trauma. For example, let's say a woman was confronting her husband right before the oil spill occurred. She may never confront him again. There are emotional symptoms of PTSD. Victims of trauma may recreate their suffering as with using verbal cruelties. Victims may become victimizers who use intimidation, humiliation, condescension, and so forth, pushing onto others their painful experiences and feelings. Beta traps. Trauma survivors can orchestrate endless entrapments, difficulties, and injustices where people lose no matter where they turn. Sound familiar? Dwelling in intense emotions. A PTSD patient may have extreme emotional reactions that linger or surface long after a trauma is over. Attraction to perpetrators of abuse and neglect. PTSD patients may esteem or otherwise support those who are consistently hurtful. Haven't you run into people who are supportive of certain oil and gas companies no matter how much damage these companies cause? Victims of abuse or trauma may avoid or control emotions that are reminiscent of that trauma. Shunning of negative feelings, like, I stay away from anyone expressing negativity. perhaps avoiding experience or information that may lead to unwanted feelings. Don't tell me what our leaders are doing about that oil spill, that's depressing. Or perhaps not feeling at all. PTSD patients also may become numb to exploitation and oppression. Haven't you all met people who are insensitive to what you're going through? There are also mental symptoms of PTSD. Victims of trauma often relive what happened through intrusive thoughts. They may have obsessions or be preoccupied with various aspects of past traumas or the possible reoccurrence of these traumas. Disturbing images are triggered by external events, as with me remembering my disaster upon hearing about yours. We might have nightmares and flashbacks. A trauma survivor may also be ever watchful, certain that another calamity is right around the corner. Victims of trauma may avoid mental activities too, such as the avoidance of decision-making or the awareness of worried thoughts. Attention, concentration, or comprehension problems are common, particularly with topics reminiscent of the trauma. Survivors may defensively forget the trauma too, or they may remember a distorted version of what happened, something that makes them feel better. Victims of trauma may rigidly adhere to unfounded beliefs. I'm sure this oil spill will be corrected in no time and life will return to normal. Trauma survivors may also be unwilling to process the past. It was traumatic, or plan for the future, which is potentially traumatic. They think, let's just stay in the moment. This particular symptom of PTSD, staying in the moment, has become so common that it's one of the main tenets of the New Age movement. Are you all noticing any of these symptoms of PTSD in your loved ones, colleagues, or in yourself? Know that the list I've given you is partial because PTSD symptoms are as vast as the varieties of trauma, but they all fit within the categories of reenactment or avoidance. Also note how these symptoms correspond to aspects of personality in everyone you know. Indeed, PTSD is epidemic in this country, but we often call it something else. For example, heredity. So people don't get the treatment they need to recover from their trauma. So let's look at the extreme examples of PTSD now. These are people who've had such chronic, catastrophic trauma that the symptoms of PTSD become habits. It's normal to try to escape from trauma, like me evacuating to Texas after the Gulf oil catastrophe, unlike those of you who've left your homes in Mayflower. But when people cannot escape the trauma, no matter how much they fight, flee, or freeze, they learn over time to escape from the aspects of their humanity that experience the ongoing trauma and the resulting pain. If the trauma is physically traumatic, they stop sensing their bodies and develop rigid, automatic behaviors. To avoid emotional trauma, they become insensitive to their own and others' feelings. To escape any mental torture, they stop paying attention to their thoughts or they stop thinking. In other words, they leave behind what makes them human. And without treatment, they live their lives more like a machine or an inanimate object. So sad. I call these people rocks because they are unthinking. And by this I mean the psychological thought of considering the heart and mind of yourself and your fellow human beings. They're also emotionally unfeeling, uncaring, and unwilling to alter their way leaving the path of PTSD. They automatically and relentlessly recreate their traumas wherever they go, and or they avoid what would remind them of these traumas at all costs. And I believe these most traumatically damaged people are what are behind your oil spill and mine in the Gulf of Mexico, and behind the lack of appropriate response. Have you met some of these rocks? You tell them what you and your family are going through, and they obviously don't care. Your words don't sink in, as if you were talking to a stone. Your needs are unheard and left unaddressed. Maybe they give you lip service. Yes, we'll certainly look into that right away, but nothing happens. Know that what they are saying and doing is exactly what happened to them when they were traumatized. And this repetition compulsion they suffer from is their way of telling their story. Know also that they will continue their destructive acts and won't take responsibility for them until they get the treatment that they so desperately need. I believe this extreme form of PTSD, the rock, is the greatest problem in our world right now. By the way, each one of those gray dots isn't a pebble, but a dead fish caused by the Gulf Oil catastrophe. I wonder who or what will be killed next. Kevin Annette is a Canadian who grew tired of seeing traumatized people harming others without incurring any punishment, so he decided to do something about it. He's currently traveling around the world helping communities set up common law courts of justice with citizen juries to hold those who commit such crimes responsible for their actions. Consider contacting Kevin and asking his help to right the wrong to your community. There's some bad press out there about Kevin, but he's a personal friend of a friend of mine, Janice. Both she and I are totally impressed at the work he is doing to help those in need. The most traumatized individuals' rocks do bad mouth or otherwise harm those who stand up to them. So I suggest you do standing up as a group and not individually. Coming together as a community is so important. Speaking of individuals, healing your own PTSD is also a priority. If your body is showing evidence of toxicity or your PTSD symptoms are affecting your ability to take care of your families, your work, or to pursue your life goals, please get professional help. The most effective professional I know is our Creator. Please take time to be with Him each day and follow His guidance for each aspect of your life. There's no quicker, more effective, nor more lasting remedy for whatever ails us. There are physical remedies for PTSD. Give yourself plenty of rest and relaxation, which includes sleep, frequent breaks, and lots of pampering. Seek healthcare professionals who can help you release the tension that might be trapped in your body tissue. And gentle exercise can help too. There are emotional treatments, such as look for the underlying emotion in any unhelpful, disrespectful, or destructive behaviors. For example, is the person who's not doing what you ask really mad about the oil spill? Show sensitivity to your own and others' emotions. We've all been through a lot. Please have compassion for one another. Encourage and support each other's constructive expression of feelings. Being upset is normal under these horrific circumstances. So use these healthy emotions to get active, informing the public, or creating poignant works of art that tell your story. Help people change destructive emotional expression into a constructive alternative. For example, you might go for a run with an angry person and let him pound his outrage into the pavement while he expresses his legitimate feelings to you. Use calming techniques, such as soothing music, holding, and breath work. And the mental treatments of PTSD. Put your mind to good use, as in figuring out what you can do about this disaster. How can you use this event to further your growth as a human being? Developing more flexibility, free from automatic reactions of fight, flight, or freeze. Becoming more aware, feeling more deeply, expressing yourself more genuinely and fully, and responding more completely to the needs of your fellow man. With my many experiences with trauma and disasters, I've learned that they can force tremendous growth as we let them, if we let them. They also compel us toward our Creator, as we need Him to survive and live happy, healthy lives. In seeking Him, we learn that our lives are not our own, to do it as we please. They belong to Him. And in following His purpose, we realize we each have a unique, essential, and powerful role to play and standing up to this destruction that is becoming the norm in our nation. Remember, rocks will relentlessly tell their stories of unrelenting trauma by acting them out upon our population until their stories are heard and their needs for extensive, intensive treatment for their extreme PTSD are finally met. To do this most effectively, however, we must first address our own symptoms of PTSD. But before we get started with the personal application part of our program, are there any questions? Okay. Yes, Dirk.
After your first little talk there, I'm gathering you also believe, like me, that most of the people that in government and think higher ups to be in charge of these companies, these CEOs, have PTSD.
I do believe PTSD is
Thank
rampant
you.
in our country.
Because I have talked to some of them, and having it myself, I know they do.
Yes.
They are rocks. They really see nothing wrong with what they do.
And as infuriating as these rocks can be, we must again have compassion for our fellow PTSD sufferers and realize they did not psychologically survive.
Right.
They lost their humanity, and they need help to get it back.
As do many of their workers.
Yes. So what I'd like to do right now, for all who are interested, is do a little personal work, because this has affected everyone personally. And get in touch with that inner voice that knows you, knows your life path, knows your life's purpose, and how we can do whatever we need to do to get you going on that. Because I believe everyone here has some important part to play that's unique to you. No one else can do your role. And we're relying on you to do that role. So to do that, I'd like to introduce a technique called focusing. This was developed by a man named Gene Genlin. And basically what we do is we break up into partnerships, and the focuser closes his or her eyes and asks a question. Could be anything from what does this physical symptom mean? Why am I feeling this way? What steps should I take with my family? Anything at all. And then we listen, trusting our inner guidance to guide us. And wherever our mind goes, we speak it out loud. And again, it can be anything. The movie I saw last night, sad feeling, I'm thinking about a conversation with my mother, a sore shoulder, anything. We just speak it out loud, and our companion speaks it back to us. Very simple. And this goes back and forth. And the reason why this is so effective is we start hearing ourselves better if someone else is speaking our words. So it's a great tool for learning listening. And the more we practice it, the more we listen to ourselves, all aspect of ourselves. Because what we find out is everything our body gives us, whether a thought, an emotional feeling, or a physical feeling, is a communication. We're taught to treat physical feelings as a problem and needs to be medicated. And not that that isn't useful, it is, of course, but it's also communication. And we need to learn to listen to that communication, especially now. So, to get started, I'd like to do a demonstration with Joanne to show you a little bit about how it's done. Please, whatever comes up in your practicing time, make sure you keep it confidential. Some personal things can come up. And also, some personal things come up, you don't have to speak them out loud, just keep them inside and work on them within yourself. You don't have to speak it out loud if it's something you don't want to share with a stranger. So we're just going to do a little demonstration right now, and I'll ask Joanne to close her eyes and take a few deep breaths just to get into a state of relaxation. And sense inside that warm, loving presence within you. It knows who you are, knows your life path, and knows what you need to do in your life right now, what steps to take. And again, you can ask a personal question, or you can just say, what's your awareness today? And speak it out loud.
I'm just so anxious. I feel a lot of turmoil inside. I can't settle down. There's so much that needs to be done. And I worry about choosing what to do. I'm afraid if I try to calm myself down, I'll lose my motivation. I'm anxious. I have trouble focusing. I just keep going from one thing to another. What should I do next?
Trouble focusing, you go from one thing to another. What should you do next? And this just brings up an important point one moment. Sometimes people will say too much that you can't repeat it all back. Just repeat the last sentence. Forgive it for the summer. Please continue.
When I focus, I still feel anxious because I'm worried about the things I'm not getting done.
You worry about the things you're not getting done.
There's so much that needs to be done, but I wonder, is the physical pain that slows my body down related to this anxiety? Which is the first problem, the pain or the worry? It's the first problem, pain and worry. How do I address that? How do I decide what's the most important, taking care of me or trying to do things I see that need to be done?
What's more important, taking care of you or taking care of things that need to be done? And you might ask that question inside and see what your inner guidance says.
I think I need to concentrate to understand. I need to do both. I need to take care of me so that I can do something. But I'm still anxious. So I have to figure out how to relieve the anxiety and help people who need to be helped and help myself.
Help yourself.
And I think deciding to try and make those plans is making me calmer right now. I am able to calm down a little and be less anxious and slow down inside in my center and in my mind. There are just so many problems. There's so many people attacking us. And I don't want to concentrate on the attack. I want to concentrate on my response. So this is helping me to calm down and make some decisions. I do feel like my head is clearer. So it's okay to focus on what I need to do for myself.
So slow down. So that's a little demonstration for y'all. Does anybody have any questions? So basically just repeat it back. That's the main thing to do, just repeat back what your focuser says. And sometimes it's the body language too. Sometimes they give really clear information, like, well, this oil spill isn't bothering me at all. Everything's going fine in my life. Your body's saying, no way. So you need to repeat back body language as well as what they say, if it's something important. Okay? So take a moment to sense inside who in this room would be a good partner for you. And we're going to do a little focusing now. The first person will do focusing for, say, about 15 minutes, and then switch, and the next person will focus for 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and share some of our notes. Okay.
Yeah, I'm from Pensacola, so.
Are you?
8 year and this. Oh my God, I think. I try to be no this. I hope I can just get out of school, I can let Saturday you guys.
How are you? Need coffee? Oh, yeah. There you go.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, people forget things, you know, I forgot my wallet. I forgot my wallet, and I had to go back home, and that's why I was a little later than I was.
All these people were, there
Dog is put textile down in one form of it. But I think it's another proprietary chemical that we have to get to know exactly.
somewhere else with your toys. I'm here to talk to you.
You're welcome. Thank you for all you do. No,
Yeah, I'm 11.
And I was wondering if sometimes going down the next couple weeks, somebody's willing to talk with me.
Most definitely.
What's your last name?
Well, thank you.
And they,
Genevieve.
and
GEN. V. Thank you.
Well, we're gonna have a working lunch, and we're gonna meet again. We have some people that may be calling in to ask questions, and so we're gonna do that while we eat. At one.
They didn't evacuate anybody on that side of the town, so.
Is there anyone else who
That's the part, some of the people are sick, they just really can't get anywhere.
somebody, how we can get off?
Right, there are a few people that I can talk to, and if you get in contact with me, I can probably get them in contact with them. Right.
Everyone's some just celebration. In our area, even if they arrive at.
There was a doctor's office that closed, across the street from the shopping center, yes. Now, the whole shopping center stayed open. The elementary school didn't close. So really, only the doctor's office is the only one that closed down for a period.
Any of the residents, there was injured to the residents, and the questions anyway, and, whatever they have to say, how expected their lives, how their lives have changed, where, basically kind of where they are now, and I'm really appreciating it. I've been on there. I'm the administrator. Oh, okay. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I put some comment recently, I never commented, so I really put my views on anything, and I think you pointed something out back to me, I remember, right?
Yes, about how the gas line ran to the backside and it comes to the
Exactly.
And now there's some, I think it was a letter to the editor, I'm not sure. But anyway, some company in Warrenburg is going to put an oil lines up in somewhere in the Morgan area. And it's, a man was upset because so many people on the right of way. I don't know all the names, I can't run through it every line, but it would be interesting to know more about it.
The law firm, I shared it on Google. I'm not sure on my personal page, but
In the speaker part.
they're wanting to propose like
It
this
is now.
court on Arkansas River, Walton, Crawford County,
Otherwise,
and
we'll just pick up what-
Conlon County, Perry County, and Walton County. It's like a committee of 5 people that donate of just 5 people. There is, I'll make sure I get it, if it's not in the rules, okay, I'll make sure I get it out there. Okay.
When I grew up, but I never seemed to have. I'd love to share.
And I do share them, but it's like I can't. Yeah, I know that's right.
There's no space there.
You did hazmat, huh?
Oh, yeah. 27 years.
What'd you tell Griffin's guy?
Well, I told him I want to come talk to him. You gotta stop putting the pimp in the hands of people that make the spirit.
Most definitely.
Speak louder, can you hear me? Okay. I hope you don't mind, I involved you in a little experiment today. And the experiment was, is I quickly went over this psychological tool. Would anybody use it? Anybody? Anybody?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Adrian.
Well, we've got a couple of maybes. So my point was that in my experience with traumas and disasters, as I mentioned to you, is they have a purpose. We have a culture that gets us to look outward. And part of life is also going inward. There's a world inside, just like the world outside. And as we grow in our development, we realize that the world outside actually mirrors the world inside. And so the disasters that we have in front of us have something to do with something going on inside that needs work, just as we're working on the outside as well. So I find that when we have these major catastrophes in our lives, and I've had a lot of them, that's forced me into this realization, there's actually a purpose for them, to get us to grow, to get us to go inside just as much as we're going outside, work inside just as much as we're working outside, and make changes in both locations. Because our situation in this country is so serious, I can't emphasize enough how much destruction is going on all over our country. I know you all know about Fukushima and the radiation levels that are getting higher. Do you know about Central Texas, how they found irradiated pipes and water? It's all over our country. And again, every one of y'all has a role to play. So if you don't want to do any inner work here in a library with strangers, I understand. But go home tonight. Find someone you can talk to. And just spend some time going inward and looking for any symptoms of PTSD that need treatment. Any problems that you need to be addressing head on and not waiting until, oh, I'll get to it next week or next month. And what is that unique role that you alone can play? Get started. Find that next step and do it. And if you don't know what it might be and you need some help, call me. Come over, get my number. I'm here all day tomorrow. I'd be glad to work with you free of charge. Let's get to what your next step is. Or if you can't make it, call me when I get home. With modern technology, it's very easy to do Skype or talk on the phone. It's almost like being here. So any questions before we continue?
How large a percentage of the general population do you feel is affected with PTSD? I know we spoke earlier about a large section, but I mean, an estimate of the percentage of the population you feel would be affected.
I have no statistics. I just have personal experience, and that's what I tend to talk from. And in my experience, it's almost everybody. Because when you consider how many people don't have the ability to turn inward, aren't aware of their emotions, aren't aware of any negative thoughts, that's a whole lot of not awareness. PTSD, mental blocking. Whenever you see the fighting, you know, some people, you bring up a topic and all of a sudden they're angry and they want to argue with you. PTSD. Fleeing. Running away. I know people, I bring up what's going on in Texas with the pollution, they're out the door. They don't want to hear about it. PTSD. Or people, they can't even see it. How many people really notice how much this country's being destroyed? PTSD. Or those that know, don't care. PTSD. Those who care, don't want to do anything about it. PTSD. Developmentally, we're 2 years old, or about 18 months, we start taking steps. 2 years old, we're walking. Same thing psychologically. If we're not taking steps, we're not even 18 months old yet. If we're not actively walking, doing our path, whatever it is to stand up to what's going on, we're not even 2 years old yet. So that's how young we are as a nation. When you look at the average person, how much they're involved. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm thinking about Dr. Mike that came and presented at one of our previous meetings, and he had identified irritation as one of the most common symptoms that follows these type of toxic exposures. And I think that it opens up a whole new line of discussion when we start to think about the far-reaching psychological issues that come about as a result of these disasters that are typically unaddressed.
Absolutely. Anything else?
Thank you for coming and for showing all this light. I wasn't here for the first part of the presentation, but I see so much of PTSD in my work and visiting with families in Mayflower in the Fayetteville Shell area, and it is so much more widespread than anyone I think is really ready to kind of acknowledge. And my mother has suffered from mental illness for a number of years, and so I'm very familiar with how environmental, forces can really just almost catapult an individual into a realm of their health that they are just so inequipped to being able to deal with, that it really does take the community as a whole to really try to address these issues, especially when it comes to environmental causes. I mean, we hear radio ads a lot for soldiers and for people who have, experienced those really traumatic events that shape their psyche and alter it. But we don't get much acknowledgement with environmental factors. And you would think by now, by 2014, that we would, that would be something that has been implemented into policy for us to really try to put our finger on and try to put some resources there for people. So just thank you for doing what you do and traveling and talking to people about this issue, because it's not one that people want to talk about, because it's very hard to address it in a way that's beneficial to the individual and to the community.
Well, you brought up some very important points in the sense that haven't you all been told not to talk about it? There are always reasons that people give you, like it might interfere with your legal case or whatever. There's always a reason, but don't talk about it. And what happens, and I believe that's big in American culture, don't talk about it and move on, because that's certainly what we were told after the Katrina disaster, actually. Just move on. And what happens when we move on is part of us is stuck there. The rest of us moves on, but that stuck part goes into the unconscious mind because we're not meeting its needs. We're not talking about what happened, and if we're not verbally talking, we go to the next lower stage of development, which is physically expressing. And this is how perpetrators of abuse are created. Not allowed to talk about being victimized, so the body starts telling the story, as I mentioned earlier. And that's how so many people become victimizers. The body is telling the story instead of their mouth. So that's why we have to encourage one another. Talk. Get it out of your system. Tell me what happened. Go into details. Breathe. Do whatever you need to do. But get it out of that physical being that will express it. If you don't, it will. Yeah. And so much of that can be that unconscious stuff. I find people think that they can put things aside like auto parts on an auto supply store shelf and it just stays there in dormancy. When every part of us is human. I put parts of myself over here, and I'm over there. Well, these parts are acting out the story, and I might not even know about it. People have split personalities. They think they're living a good Christian life or whatever, and this part of them is doing horrible things because they've had traumas that they've never resolved, and so they're acting them out. This is so common in our society.
And it's one of the least funded, psychiatric medical care is the least funded social program that we have. But it affects a vast majority of our population. And I've had such a struggle with trying to figure out why we would not acknowledge that.
And I would wager that it's PTSD. Because it's so painful, it's so traumatic, just how devastated the average American has become.
I agree. Even with my mother, even though it's a depression / bipolar diagnosis, A lot of times people think of those types of diseases as being something you were born with sometimes, and sometimes it is, but in her case, it was, trauma from childhood. And I think some other factors probably factored in as well. But people just we don't acknowledge those early childhood exposures to trauma as being something that really sets you up for your adult life mentally.
Absolutely. It's so important. I think it should be taught in schools. I think everyone should know this information at a young age, so that they're processing it and dealing with the traumas that's part of living in this world. We all have them. It's just a matter of what do we do with them. Do we fight them off every time we see them? We try to fight with the person or fight with those parts of ourselves? Do we flee and run away every time we hear about them, or it comes up inside, we get a drink or something and go into something else? Do we freeze? We just don't take in the information, whether it's coming from outside or inside? Or are we free to work with these things? Work with them in such a way that we become more human, as I mentioned, more capable, more feeling, more thinking thoughtful, and more active in our communities to fight these problems. Anybody else?
Thank you so much.